crucial conversation on racism and racial discrimination. This webinar is brought to you courtesy of RCCG ChristEmbassy. While we're having this discussion, the recent murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Tony McDade, Rashad Brooks have once again brought to forefront the issue of racial injustice. There's an ongoing outcry for reforms. The Black Lives Matter movement gained momentum. The topic of racial discrimination is now reverberating in all of our institutions. The time is upon us to begin the bold conversations that can spark change, a change in our communities, our workplaces, in our homes. There is hope that these micro changes will have macro impact that will benefit generations after us, that will influence policies, that will eliminate systemic racism. There's no question that racism is real and pervades a lot of our institutions. While some people are living in denial, some people are not even aware the microaggression happening to them. There are others who are coming to terms with the tragic stories that have traumatized many. The impact is real, but sometimes subtle. Our speakers today will do justice to that. Today, we're going to look back to look forward. Our experienced speakers will share their stories. They will take us back in history. Maya Angelou says, I have great respect for the past. If you don't know where you've come from, you don't know where you're going. We will gain insights into the history of racism, understand the difference between racism and racial discrimination. We will hear some ideas of way forward. My favorite quotes from Michelle Obama says that when they go low, we go high. It is time for us to pull through these obstacles and go high. We're looking for change that is sustainable. We are on the verge of history. We're about to turn a major curve in our lifetime, and our generations and generations after us will be grateful for it. We're hoping for a future where people will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. My ask and hope is that we will all join the movement. We will take action. We will speak out. We will support each other and be a change advocate. We will make mistakes. We will fail forward. I want to remind us that regarding the issue of racism and racial discrimination, we know that when in Genesis 1, when God created man, he said, everything that I made was good. There is no inferior being. There's no inferior person. God made everyone good, equal, and perfect. And the Bible says that God is no respecter of persons. And so in that light, I want to highlight the fact that from that lens to help us shift our mindset that we are not inferior. We're made in the image and the likeness of God. And so before I introduce our guest speakers, I just want to remind us of a little bit of logistics. The guest speakers are going to share their stories. Afterwards, you're free to post your questions in the chat box. As you go on, if you have questions, post in the chat box. It will be monitored by Baba. And then we will take questions at the end of the session as well. Again, just a gentle reminder to please remain muted and keep your videos turned off. We may, in the event that we're not able to answer all the questions, we will post a Q&A on the church's website, which is rccgchristembassy.org. So I'm now going to turn the conversation to two phenomenal ladies. I love them. I've watched them and I've heard them speak before. They are passionate about this subject, and you're going to see why shortly. They are experts at the subject matters, and I'm so thrilled to have them with us today to share their insights, to share their stories with us. And so just a little bit of a introduction to them, and I'm trying to spotlight. So let me first start by introducing Jenny Matthew Tusu. Yeah, thanks for doing that. So Jenny is committed to building a socially responsible city through systems change by co-creating social policies and strategies with communities. Dedicated to continuous learning and reflection, she facilitates open conversations about racism and discrimination and our roles in social justice. She's lucky to have two amazing daughters and a supportive spouse stick by her on her journey to making change. Welcome, Jenny. We're really happy to have you here.
Thank you so very much. Appreciate it.
And I'd like to turn the spotlight to Cynthia Okafor. Cynthia is a registered social worker with over 17 years of experience in the social services sector. She first began her career within the immigration sector by coordinating services and programs for vulnerable women and young adults, and later went on to working as a research assistant and facilitator within the area of diversity and inclusion. In her current position, Cynthia works with nonprofit organizations to enhance the social well-being of Calgarians by delivering prevention-based services. She currently holds a Bachelor of Social degree from the University of Calgary and a Master's of Social Work degree from Carleton University. Cynthia is quite involved with social justice and equity work within the broader Calgary community and works tirelessly to create an environment that acknowledges, embraces, and values differences. It is an honor and a privilege to have you here on this platform. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I'm now going to pass it over to you ladies to, take us to that height. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. So thank you, for the lovely introduction. Jenny and I are truly honored to be with you all this afternoon and look forward to spending the next 2 hours with you discussing the subject of racism. So before we jump fully into the session, Jenny and I thought, we would spend some time, about 20 minutes or so, sort of introducing you to ourselves, who we are, telling you our stories and how it is that we got to where we're at. So thank you. I'm just quickly going to share our slide presentation, get that set up before I get started. Let's see. Is that good? Can everyone see that? Jenny? Yeah, perfect. Okay. So that's me, probably at the age of 3. I know I look quite innocent here, believe me, but believe me, I wasn't all that innocent, hence the middle name Rascal, or that my parents used to call me, given that I was quite mischievous as a child and into everything that you can think of. And sadly, I feel like God has repaid me. I do have a son who is exactly like me, and I'm suffering just like my parents did. So that's me. So to start off with my story, so I was born and raised here in Calgary, Alberta, as you can tell by the last name. My parents immigrated here from Nigeria to Canada back in the early 70s. And back then they were considered the first set of Nigerians that landed in Calgary, among others that were living here during that time. Now, despite being raised here in Calgary, I may have identified as being Canadian when I stepped out of the household. But you better believe that when I came back into my household, a Nigerian household, I was Nigerian. So yes, my parents, were big on preserving the Igbo culture and ensured that my siblings and I were deeply connected to our roots, our values, and had a strong sense of who we were as Nigerians. So I'm just so that's my parents on the side, and then my siblings. So life was pretty normal for me growing up. As in any Nigerian household, my parents had really high expectations when it came to a few things. So the first one being respect. So ensuring that my siblings and I respected and honored our parents and each other. The second one being that we respected and honored the family name when we stepped out of the home. And the third one being education. My parents were really big on education and ensured that my siblings and I worked extremely hard in school in order to attain a certain level of success and get to where we're at today. So that's me, about age 5. So as I mentioned again, pretty normal childhood. I was happy, carefree, and didn't have much by the way of stress back then. Now, it was a completely different story when I entered the school system at the tender age of 5. I was about to start grade 1, and it was an exciting time for my parents. It was an exciting time for myself as I was getting ready to embark on a new milestone. Now, within a few months of starting school, my parents were called in for a case consultation where my teacher had recommended putting me in ESL. I know the name has changed now, but back then, so the acronym stood for English as a Second Language. So the teacher's reason, one which clearly was based on assumptions, was that since my parents came from another country and didn't speak English at home, she figured that I would benefit and thrive from being in the ESL program at the school. She also felt that because I was having a hard time pronouncing certain words such as yellow and rice, something that I believe most 5-year-olds, struggle with at that age, she felt that it would be better for me to transition into the program in order for me to get that head start that I needed. Now, the irony of this is that something my parents vocalized to the teacher was that despite being Nigerian and coming from a place with many different languages and dialects, they came from primarily an English-speaking country. Not only that, they were educated in a system that was modeled after the British school system, similar to what we had here in Canada. And as I'm sure you can imagine, the teacher stood there speechless, wasn't quite sure how to react. But luckily for me, I got to stay within a regular classroom setting and ended up thriving as a result. Now, sadly, I wasn't the only child in my family to go through this experience in elementary school. And in fact, my one brother, who was also born and raised in Calgary, went through a similar experience when he started the school system as well. And what's even more sad is if you talk to, a lot of the Black parents that have resided here in the 70s, 80s, their children went through the similar experience as well. Now, unfortunately, this would be the first of many racial experiences that I had gone throughout elementary school and throughout my adult experience. I would go on to being bullied, teased, and taunted by my peers, picked on and humiliated by my teachers in the classroom, ignored, devalued, and disrespected within the workplace simply because of my race. Now, as much as my parents worked hard to support the family by putting a roof over our head, food on the table, clothing on our backs, my parents really struggled with how to support us, in the face of racism. And I can't say that I blame them because they were going through the same thing as well. So either working and going to university at the time. Now, the message that I would often receive from my parents was that racism here in this country was simply a sacrifice that Blacks living here, Blacks who have immigrated, had to make, for the sake of living in this country. And as much as I was frustrated with the daily assaults, the microaggressions, the abuse, I simply had to suck it up in order to survive. And that's simply what my parents had to do as well. Now, for me, as I got older, became more mature and became a mother, this simply wasn't good enough. There was something within my spirit that compelled me to fight. And that's exactly what I've been doing over the last 20 years. I've been fighting. And with that, I've also made a commitment to myself. I'm just going to change the slide. To many others like me and my children in particular, to continue fighting for racial justice and equity, and I've not slowed down since. So that's me. Thank you.
So I guess it's my turn, hey? Thank you, Cynthia, for your story. One back, yeah, that's
Yes.
rules. Thank you, Cynthia. I'm going to be asking Cynthia to control the slides because yeah, I'm not so good sometimes at navigating slides and speaking at the same time when it comes to virtual presentations. But I am really fortunate. I am a friend of Cynthia Okafor's and a colleague. So we both work together actually at the city of Calgary. Anyway, I am Jenny Matthews Tasu. I'm a proud second generation Malayali woman. and I am the daughter of Muthachin Matthews and Penama and Gerald from the House of Chitard in the southern state of Kerala in India. Now, this is really important to me. I like to always introduce myself by the fact that I am the daughter of my parents. And it's my ancestry, and it helps situate my story in a time and place. And it also frames my responsibility in life. So what's really cool is that I come from a really proud heritage where it was the women who dared to dream, to take risks and the courage to reach for it. And it was our women actually who traveled around the world, not our men. So they were the ones who actually traveled to Europe, to North America, to Australia, to a variety of places around the world as nurses and created our communities. And then our men came later. And what I'm really fortunate about is that my mother was one of those very brave women. And I have a whole story about it, but I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk a little bit more about myself. But here's the thing, I wasn't really proud of my heritage and my family as I was growing up. Cynthia, next slide, please. I grew up in a town or a city called Medicine Hat, and I don't know if anybody has been there, but I grew up there in the 1970s, and it was really tough to grow up there. I grew up in a very traditional Indian family with high expectations also for our behavior. I'll take it to the next slide, Cynthia. So this is my family, and I actually, the person next to me is my twin brother. His name is Jimmy. So this is my brother and I with my parents. And so like Cynthia talked about how there were really high expectations in terms of our behavior and our academic success. So we were really similar in terms of how our families, what the expectations were. They came here for a reason, right? And so they wanted a better life for their families, and they expected us to maintain a certain standard. But here's the thing, and I can't speak to other people, but my dad hated being here. He hated being here in Canada, and he was only going to be here in this country for 5 years max. That was all he was going to do. And then his plan was to go back home. He was going to make some money, help support his family, and go back. Fortunately, it didn't happen that way for him. Fortunately for me, but not so much for him. And he was a man with a really bad temper. And so he had a lot of anger. And as I said, he resented being here. And he had, at that time, also a wife that didn't challenge him. So this kind of resulted in a family environment where my brother and I didn't feel safe being at home because he just never knew what would possibly set him off. The other interesting thing that we faced was that we had no family in Medicine Hat, right? So it was the four of us that you're seeing on the screen, that's all you're seeing. And so that was all of us in terms of our family. There were very, very few Indian families that lived there at the time. And so what I had in the next picture, please. So you'll notice that our aunties were not actually Malayali, or they weren't Indian aunties. My aunties were German aunties, right? So I grew up in a very, very, very white city. My brother and I were the only two kids of color in our entire neighborhood, and there just wasn't many in our city as well. So I had my German aunties who I adored. I also, on the other picture, and you can laugh all you want, but that was my brother and I, we were in Highland dancing too, right? So you can imagine that there weren't very opportunities for us to learn our culture. So my mom would put us into dance, but we were actually, I could do myself a mean Highland dance if you ever want, but we did that for a long time. Next slide, Cynthia, please. So here's my class, and this is my brother and I in grade 3, and I'm actually in the center of this picture, and it was really difficult actually to be a kid who looked different, and you can tell that I'm the only one wearing this floral dress. My mom believed that we were not allowed to wear jeans. We had to dress appropriate too when we went to school. So this wasn't uncommon, where my mom would send me off to school in these floral dresses while everyone else got to wear like pants and jeans. My brother's in the corner there in that powder pink outfit. I mean, yeah, it was tough to be him, right? Like, you know, like, and so I felt for him because he, like, you know, he was stuck in the situation. So throughout school, and so this is just a picture of what our class looked like. So as you can tell, my brother and I were the only two brown people of color of anything. Like this was it. And this was it for the entire school. So I want to be also really clear. Jimmy and I were the only two kids of color in that entire school. And my classmates and teachers They hated people like us. They hated people looking like me. And so this was a really tough time. We were constantly called names. And I mean, here's some creative ones for you, right? So I was called Big Blackfoot's Turd, Packy, of course, Greasy Leaf, like, you know, really unique ones, and also some very common ones, which I'm sure you know about, but I won't talk too much about it as well. But the problem also was is that my brother and I we were constantly being beaten up, or we were constantly being threatened to be beaten up on a daily basis. So this was my childhood. And so you can imagine that I also didn't feel safe being in school as well. Next slide, please. All through this though, so like I believed the story though, like, so this is the problem being raised in this. I believed the story, and the story is that this is what I was told, is that everybody who came from India, we were all poor. We were all poor people. We were living in grass huts. We ate things like rats and bugs, apparently. We were not that terribly civilized. And that was their view of them. And I bought into that story because I didn't really know anything else. Is that I believed that story. And as a result, I didn't particularly like myself. I didn't like myself being Indian, and I resented the idea that I had brown skin. I wanted to be like everyone else. And so, you know, and when I would go to India, it would be really, really difficult. And so this is my family actually in Kerala in India. And so when I would go to India, I wouldn't feel comfortable there either. So like, you know, I was really struggling with my identity here, like, you know, in Medicine Hat, right, being amongst, you know, white people, but then going back to India and not feeling like I fit there as well. So I was really uncomfortable in my own skin. Next slide, please. But, you know, interestingly enough, this is a group of Malayali kids, like, and I'm in the center in the pink shirt. But it was interesting. Oddly enough, I would feel comfortable only when other Malayalis would come visit Medicine Hat. Now, the group of people that you see here, 2 of them I had never met before that day. But for some reason, I could bond with them. There was something that drew me, and we all shared this common experience of being born and raised here, and we just became instant friends. And so it was just a really interesting. I didn't understand why I could easily connect with people who were not my classmates. Next slide, please. So you can imagine, so this is me. I was a really lonely kid. I was a really lonely kid, and I was a really angry kid. And the thing is I really didn't have any friends or family to talk to, right? So no friends at school. Well, they wouldn't acknowledge me in school. They might talk to me outside of school, but they would completely ignore me in school. And so a lot of times, like, I mean, there's so much that I could talk about. Like, you know, when I think about Cynthia, when she talks about how her parents reacted when she tried to talk to them about, you know, racism, what I got was my dad was, as I said, an angry man. He didn't put up with anything. And so he would go in there with like gangbusters, right? And just tear people apart. Like, people were scared of my father, but that also included my brother and I. And so what did I do? How did I get through this? And this is really important for me. And this is kind of a part of my journey that really defines who I am as a person. I would always say that I would stay up, even as a child, as young as grade 3, grade 4. I would stay up all night talking to my invisible friend. And who was my invisible friend? It was actually God. God was my friend. He was there always to listen to me through all of it. And as I kind of got older, my questions changed, but, you know, every day I would stay up all night talking to him, trying to understand what was going on and what was I supposed to do about this. By the age of 30, if you could believe it, this is when I got tired of my anger. I got tired of hating myself, and I got tired of hating my community. And what I realized is that I needed to forgive myself. I needed to forgive myself for everything that was going on. I needed to forgive my family for, you know, everything that happened, and also my community. The Malayali community, but also the white communities that I was living in. And this took a long time of prayer and reflection, but I have come to a much better place. I'm happier, I'm much more at peace. Next slide, please. And it's at that stage that I decided to learn more about who I was as a person. I connected far more to learning about what it meant to be a Malayali, like what it meant to be from a place like Kerala. And man, like it was amazing the things I learned about my heritage, how brilliant our people were, how our women were so strong, how we have the most doctors that come out of there in the entire world. We have the highest literacy rate in the entire world. I mean, that's pretty impressive. But it was also then I finally realized my calling in life, what God had been asking of me all this time, and he continues to ask of me of this day. And this quote actually really speaks to what my calling is. And what I'm being asked to do is to elevate the voices of those whose voices have been deliberately silenced and ignored. And so that is my job. When I think about the work that I do at the City of Calgary, I'm the program lead for Resilient Calgary, meaning that I look at how do we build relationships, our equity-seeking communities, how do we build relationships with institutions like government and private organizations and not-for-profit, the whole gamut. I also teach at the university at the Faculty of Social Work in social policy and social justice. All of what I do is to honor that calling, is to develop people to, so that they can also be responsible to elevate people's voices. I do not, and I want to stress this, I do not believe in the voiceless. I do not think that there is such a thing as voiceless people. I think we all have a voice, but we live in a society that chooses not to hear us. And so my job is to figure out ways to get society to listen to us. Anyway, so that's my story. And if anyone has a chance or wants to take a chance to ask Cynthia or myself about our life stories, here's an opportunity to do so. Just so you know, Cynthia will be going next, and she's going to be diving quite deep into racism, right? So, so we can have a deeper understanding of racism. So if there are any questions about that, as I said, we can answer that in the next section, but anything quickly before I hand it over to Cynthia?
Okay. Okay.
Hello?
Oh, do we have a question?
Yeah. Hello.
Hi.
Yeah. Thank you so much. My name is Pastor Samuel. I'm one of the pastor. I'm a pastor of a church of RCCG Church in Calgary. I appreciate your presentation this morning. Maybe this afternoon. But I want to ask a question, please, regarding my place of work. By profession, I'm a social worker, registered social worker as my profession, and I work with a senior community in Calgary. Something happened during all this issue of the Black Life Matter stuff. Personally, I was expecting my organization to raise the issue or maybe to just address the issue, but I never see any circular, no official statement, nothing from my organization, even talking about this issue of the Black Matter. And each time I think of it, and some other Black people or the people of color in the organization, it's really giving me a concern, but I don't know what to do about it. Secondly, in my team, we have a team of 6 social workers in the organization, and I was asked to make a presentation on a particular, the senior finances in our place of work. I did the presentation. I think we're about 8 people at that presentation. 3 of us were Black, the others are white. But at the end of the presentation, it's only 3 Black people that were in the midst. They were the ones that sent me a thank you message on my email to thank me for the presentation. The other 4 white ladies, none of them even acknowledged, none of them even say thank you. Meanwhile, during the course, they were the ones that asked the most questions, but none of them even ever give me a feedback and say thank you. So when I think of these 2 events that really happened recently, it gives me a concern that should I raise my voice? Should I be silent on it? Thank you.
Yeah. So Jenny, maybe did you want me to take a stab at this one? Yeah, I think just speaking from experience and just with Jenny and I working in government and community, I think one of the best things that the Black Lives Matter movement has done for us is giving us that opportunity to raise our voice and to be a lot more vocal than we've been on these issues, the issues of race and racism. However, my advice would be, and I think it just really boils down to one of survival in the workplace. is, you know, you sort of have to, that's the reality. You have to assess your work environment and make sure it's safe enough, it's a comfortable environment and welcoming for you to use your voice. And you know, and I've been there many times myself where it isn't safe, and I have to assess the environment to know when to speak up and when to remain silent. And so if you have anyone in administration, perhaps leadership, that you're close enough with, you have a pretty good relationship with, maybe I would use that approach as a starting point. But again, you have to assess the safety of your environment before even doing so. And that's just the reality of living in the environment that we live in. Jenny, I don't know if you had anything that you wanted to add.
Yeah, I mean, they're great questions, and this is really difficult. And Cynthia's right about assessing the situation. First, I wanted to talk a little bit about your first question about how to even get your organization talking about this issue. The sad thing is, I mean, it took 70,000 signatures on a petition to get the city of Calgary to talk about this. Like, so, right, like, so imagine that, right? 70,000 signatures from the Canadian Cultural Mosaic Foundation to say, hey, you know what? We need to talk about this. And so, you know, we've learned that many times it's community pressure that is required to get people to talk. Like, we can talk about it quite a bit, but it's, for some reason, community pressure gets people to talk about it. And so there's that kind of piece. And this is said, it's difficult sometimes when it comes to our organizations, depending on your organization and who's in leadership and who's the managers. If there's one or two people who understand that Black Lives Matter is an important social movement, you know, this is one of the very few times I think that, you know, you can say, hey, you know what? There's an important social movement happening right now. In my opinion, the other pandemic that is going on in this society is racism. You know, we need as an organization to talk about it with somebody on your management team, especially because, you know, and I know I have a bias, like, you know, as social workers, it is our responsibility to be able to move that forward. The second one is about in your workplace. And I hear you, like, you know, a lot of times people will either ignore me and I do talk in meetings. I usually, what happens is when I see something racist that's going on or something that's really bothering me, I generally let the conversation kind of happen. I listen. I'd like to listen and hear all sides of a conversation. But by the end, a lot of times I just can't take it anymore, to be honest with you. But I will respond, and I'll say something. And more often than not, I get that blank look that, you know, they don't know what to say to me because I've challenged them in such a way that they don't quite understand. And the fact is that we live in a society where so many well-intentioned people hate to be called racist. And so it's how we word it in such, and this is hard work, but how do we word it so that they don't just shut down with us, but they actually enter into more of a growth mindset? So what kind of question can you ask? And sometimes that's what I do. I'll ask questions so that I'm not telling them that they're racist because they shut down, but just in terms of how do I encourage them to have a growth mindset?
Yeah, and maybe just real quickly to add to that second part of your question is, I think it's so important in work, just with everyday life, to find your personal cheerleaders. So not everybody's going to support you, not everybody's going to like you, and so I think it's important to find those people. So even in my my business unit, you know, there's maybe a few people that I know that I can go to when I'm having issues or I'm experiencing problems. When I need a pat on the back, I know to go to those people. They're going to support me. And so that's just, you know, food for thought, something to keep in mind.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
So we're just, Jenny, do you want to go over this or should we?
I'm going to let you take it on.
Sure.
And then if there's a couple of questions, I'll let you.
Yeah, just in the interest of time. So what Jenny and I thought we would do now is, like, we felt this piece was really critical to the presentation. And that's the importance of going over definitions with a bit of teaching. That way you have an understanding of what racism is, how it operates, and how to dismantle it, right? So I find, you know, just through my teaching and my work in the community, a lot of people don't have that strong foundation when it comes to racism. And I feel that when it comes to understanding your place, you know, the social position that we as racialized people find ourselves, it's important to start from the beginning. And I don't know how many parents are joining us this afternoon. History matters. I cannot stress the importance of your children having a strong identity in who they are when it comes to their culture. When I think back to conversations I used to have with my dad all the time, he was big on us, you know, not losing who we are as Nigerians here in Canada. And, you know, as much as me and my siblings saw ourselves as Canadian, you know, my dad was a bit critical in that he knew that at the end of the day, you know, the people here saw us as Black children, as immigrants. He knew that we would never be accepted. And so that's why him and my mother worked really hard to retain those traditional Nigerian values, the values within Igbo culture, so that if we were, you know, seen as being foreign and not as welcomed within the place we were born in, then there was always somewhere to look back to. So just something to keep in mind. So what I thought I would do is start from the very beginning. And Jenny, feel free to jump in, you know, by looking at what has sparked, you know, the place in which we find ourselves with racism to begin with. And so colonization. I won't read the definition, but I'll just do a bit of teaching around that. So when we think about colonization at the early beginnings, it is important to the discussion of racism, as the two have been intertwined throughout history and enabled human rights violations like segregation, theft of lands, removal of children, and restriction of economic and civic participation. We have seen examples of this. We've seen it in Africa, and we've also seen it here within North America. So when we look at the experiences of Indigenous people, the taking of their lands, wealth, and labor, this is what characterizes, you know, North America. Same thing, the experiences in British, but mainly the creation of North America. Even when we look at the movement of slaves through the transatlantic slave trade, the brutal treatment of Indigenous people, right up until today, we see implications for these two communities. And so, you know, when you turn on the news, you know, especially for those of you that have come new from elsewhere, and you don't really understand what it's all about, the movement, the protests, both in the Indigenous community and the Black community, this is where it comes from. So I think we need to go back in history and look at the role that colonization played with that. Jenny, did you have anything to add?
I did actually. You know, I'm going to ask this question, and hopefully, and you know, and I'm okay if people unmute to see what their thoughts are. So, you know, when we talk about colonization, we talk quite a bit about it, but does anyone really know how colonization even started? Like when it started, how it started? Does anybody have any ideas about that? And if you have any thoughts on where it started, that would be, as I said, you can unmute yourself.
And real quick, you know, just to jump in, for me, I had no clue. I'm very fortunate to have a university education. So it was first year university. I had registered for an elective. I registered for African Studies and African History. And it's funny because African history was being taught by a white professor who had referred to Africa as the dark continent. So having no history prior to 1500, which we know is false, absolutely not true. And so I thank God every day for that opportunity to learn, to go back, to do a bit more research and to learn about who I was as a Black woman, who I was as an African, as a Nigerian woman. I'm very grateful for that. So I don't know if we have any questions, but we can open it up.
I was going to say, Cynthia, so let me let people know kind of like where colonization like started. Like, you know, when you start learning about the history of racism and colonization, I am also a firm believer that you need to understand it. So there is, back in 1493, so think about it that, okay, 1493, there was what they call the doctrine of discovery. And, you know, if you ever have time, like sit and research this out, because this is when it was established that there was a justification, there was a spiritual justification, a political one, and a legal one, justification of colonization, which allowed Europeans, white Europeans, to seize the land inhabited by Christians. So that's really important to know. So this justified Christian European white explorers to claim land, right, and waterways that they supposedly discovered. And their whole idea was if you were not Christian and you were not white, you were not human. And if you were not human, it gave you all the right to be able to take the land, to live the land, to take the land, right? It gave them the right to murder, to have forced assimilation, because people weren't seen as people. And so there was this doctrine established back in 1493 that really started the idea that Black and brown people were not human, right? And so therefore it's okay to take the land of non-humans, right? It was okay to force assimilation to the white ways of being. And this actually truly fueled white supremacy. And you think about how it continues and how people have used the excuse, and I say use the excuse of divine design, right? So they had a spiritual justification as well. They used that to claim cultural superiority. So I want to, like, a lot of times I'd like to frame it that this has been going on since like the 1400s. And that's why when you think about the countries that we live in, my country, my family's from India, and the colonization of India, and how it destroyed our countries, it comes from the doctrine of discovery. So anyway, I just wanted to throw that piece in.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if there's no questions at this point, and we'll take questions at the end, I'm just going to move on. And I think, Jenny's sort of provides a bit more context and a perfect segue into race. So again, I do have the definition up there. But, for us, it was sort of like during the 1700s, 1800s that we saw the development of race-based theory, which is also what we refer to as scientific racism. Okay, so we saw this by the scientific community in Europe and the United States with the practice of craniometry. And so this was the measurement of the brain and skull, and what came out of that was the development of 4 distinct races. Now, according to the science claims that the larger the brain, the higher the intelligence. So at this time, those with the largest brains and thus the smartest brains were Caucasoids. And so this is our reference of white people. And this is where sort of the reference of, or the designation of Caucasian comes from, okay? Next, we have Mongoloid, so referencing yellow people and those of Asian descent. Then we have Australoid, signifying red or brown people. And then the Negroid was at the bottom. So signifying those considered Black and those that were at the lowest of the racial hierarchy, okay? So what's important to note here when we talk about race is that there is no scientific basis to these claims. Today, you do have many advocates. We have those in the education sector that are still relying on old, outdated theories around race. They do not exist. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. And then racism. So I think this is a huge topic here, and I think one that deserves quite a bit of attention. So I'll just read that real quick. So racism, it's a system of power that structures opportunity and assigns value based on the social construct. So it's a social construct of race where privilege is afforded to whiteness. Racism is a system that unfairly disadvantages people of color while subsequently unfairly advantaging white people. So again, when I engage in conversations around racism with racialized audiences, with white audiences, there is a huge misconception of racism, what it is, how it manifests. I find that a lot of people tend to see racism as being based on individual acts. So it's more on those interpersonal relationships, but that's not the case. Racism is much more complex than that. And so that's why I think it's important to always go through the definition so people have a firm understanding of what it is. So when it comes to racism, there's 4 dimensions of racism. I usually combine the 2, and I'll explain that in a bit. So there's interpersonal racism, internalized racism, institutional, and systemic. And Jenny, again, feel free to jump in. So when we look at interpersonal racism, So it lies at the interpersonal level. And this is where we bring our private beliefs about race into our interactions with people. So when you think of how it expresses itself, it's prejudice, it's hate and bias, threats and harassment. So name calling could be a really good example, vandalism, right? But again, a lot of people think this is what racism is. This is where it stops. But again, as I go through the other definitions, again, you'll realize it's much more complex than that. When we take a look at internalized racism, and Jenny, I'll get you to jump in because I know you have really good examples with this one. Internalized racism lies within the individuals, okay? So this is a process where whites have internalized their superiority and a process where people of color have internalized their inferiority. So in speaking to people of color, it's a process where they have internalized the racism from the broader general society. And this often manifests itself into, private and personal beliefs about oneself and one's race. So I often use the example colorism. The role of colorism is a good example. So for me, being Nigerian, we know that there is often a preference for lighter skin. We do know that younger girls often feel that pressure. Like just look at skin bleaching products. If you go into any of the African markets here, African, Caribbean, Asian, there's shelves full of skin bleaching products, soaps and creams, right? And so again, that sending that message that, dark skin is just simply not good enough. I remember when I attended a function, I brought one of my friends, she's a Nigerian girl as well, much lighter in complexion than I am. And so I was cast off to the side and a group of men just surrounded her and just went on about, how beautiful she was and her beautiful light skin, and she must be from the River State area. And I'm watching this conversation go on and I was just puzzled. Because for me, that's not my reality. Like I said, I grew up here. I didn't grow up in Nigeria. I'm very proud of my skin. I couldn't imagine, giving in to some of those messages. I think maybe my challenge when it comes to internalized racism is hair, often the mixed messages. So at one point I went through a stage where I wore my hair natural, the way God made me, and that wasn't good enough, right? The messages that, well, you don't look good like that. You look ugly, you look like a man, you look more beautiful, why don't you do something different with your hair? And so it's almost like a trauma. It's something that I still struggle with till this day, right? If I could wear my hair natural, I would, but it's difficult based on those messages, conflicting messages that I get in society. And I've been on job interviews. I remember one in particular, I wore my hair natural and I was asked that if I got the position, would I wear my hair in its natural state? Would you wear your hair like that? So that's a really good example of the struggle when it comes to internalized racism. Jenny, did you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts when it comes to especially internalized racism. One of the key ones I wanted to stress right from the start is that internalized racism is an impact of racism. Yes. I do not believe it is a type of racism. So it's an impact. And why is it an impact? It's because we, as our communities, our Black and Brown people, we believe the dominant story. So when I talked about my childhood, about how I believed the story without question, it's because racism, one of the impacts is that we as people of color, we believe the story that we're less than. Right? That we believe actually our color should be lighter. So to Cynthia's point, so we will use whatever products like ours is, and Cynthia and I were joking around about it yesterday, I think Laura too, right? About the Fair and Lovely, right? Like that's our cream, right? Like our skin to make it lighter. And it's not just, in the Asian communities, a lot of people associate hair and skin. In some of the Asian communities, they will actually go to an extreme of breaking their legs, right? And try to like stretch their bones and their legs so that they can get to be, let's say, an inch taller. Why is that? Because we're given the message that white people who generally tend to be taller, right? You get more success if you could be more white. So they will go to extremes of changing their nose, their eyes, right? Even through painful surgeries so that they could become more white-like. So when people like, and we'll talk a little bit more about it afterwards, but when people talk about that they never experienced racism at home, I strongly disagree, because they've been practicing the impacts of racism. Back home, my spouse, he's from the northern part of India, and my daughter, you wouldn't even know she was Indian. But they are so fair-skinned and they're revered, right? They like, everybody talks about how beautiful they are, to Cynthia's point. Well, that's an impact of racism. We believe that story, right? And that's what colonization did to us. So I will always disagree with people when they say, well, no, we never had racism back home. No, like I would disagree with you. And so you think about the practices and what we value. So remember, when people talk about internalized racism, it's about how we as a community have accepted the dominant story that white is better. Yeah. White ways of being, white ways of looking, right? All of it. We've bought into that story. And I'm not saying that, we haven't tried to challenge. Absolutely, I get that. But that's really what internalized racism is. And, and what do we do? And then an extreme form of that is what they call lateral violence. And lateral violence is a time where actually members of the community will pull down people in our community when they're achieving some kind of success. So that story about the crabs in the bucket, you get one crab coming out and then all the crabs will pull that crab down, right? That is actually called lateral violence. And that is a form of internalized racism. It's an impact of racism, because we are now going against each other to keep ourselves down. But it is not a form of racism. So I just want to be really clear about that. Cynthia, please go on. Sorry.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jenny. And so, the last little bit, and so again, what I've done is I've combined the last two, which is systemic and institutional racism. And so systemic or institutional racism, so it focuses on how racism operates across institutions and how these ideas of white supremacy is captured at a systems level. So again, when we elevate the conversation, really what we're doing is removing the definition of racism at that, interpersonal level. And this is really what we're focusing on, is sort of that culmination of racism at a systems level. So again, when we're looking at how it operates, we're looking at it within structures, policy, how racism is embedded within our policy structures, government, healthcare, schools. So a really good example of that is when I look at the school curriculum. I know there's been many community advocates that have proposed to the government that we need to change our curriculum. It's very much based, it's a Eurocentric curriculum, it's outdated, and it's one that many kids cannot identify with. And so I know we've made a little bit of progress with the work of Truth and Reconciliation. I know the Indigenous community has worked really hard to embed Indigenous teachings and ways within the school system. I would love to get to a point where it's culture. We learn about different culture and the experiences of different groups. So again, the Chinese experience and the head tax, or the Japanese experience and the intern camps, or the experiences of the Sikh community in BC. This is all, part of our Canadian history, but we don't know about it. And so, and it would be nice. I know I get called into my children's school to do something for Black History Month. Well, why is Black History Month? Why do we have 1 month to learn about Black history? I think, all year round, we should be learning about different cultures. So not just Black history or Indigenous, but, different cultural structures. Yes, Jenny, go ahead.
Good point. And, I feel like, when it comes to this piece, it's more than just learning about our cultures, right? Like, you hear about people talking about decolonizing systems, and that's where, this is where this plays out in the systems and institutions. It's about how do we have the whiteness of systems. Everything about a system is white. And so it's more than just learning about our different cultures, but it's about challenging our notions of what is the right ways of doing things. So, one of the projects I'm working on at work is about how do we look at governance, how we make decisions at the leadership table, and processes that we use, are they necessarily the right process? And it's about looking at the water that we swim in, and it doesn't necessarily work for all people. So it's about learning our cultures, but it's also about challenging our notions about who decided what is right and wrong in a system, and who actually benefits from the policies policies and processes and practices in the system, and who are excluded from that. And you know, and part of the work that I know I do at Resilience is about challenging that notion as well.
Yeah, perfect. And then, you know, this really isn't it part of the definition. It's sort of this concept of reverse racism. I'm bringing this up because it often comes up. So if I'm engaged in dialogue or conversation, you know, with different groups, white people in particular, I always get reverse racism is always thrown in my face. Well, what about you Black people? You know, you Black people are racist to we as white people. You know, but I have to say, you know, just that whole concept of reverse racism is a myth. So even though we as racialized people can discriminate against white people, it's not considered racism because of the systemic relationship that white people have when it comes to power. And so for me, as a racialized woman, I don't have the power to alter the life course of a white person. I don't have the power. So therefore, reverse racism does not exist. Okay. What I want to do real quick, I'm going to show a video by, I'm going to just stop sharing and then share. Let's see if I can get this right. Can you still see the?
We still see you right now. We see you right now, Cynthia. We don't see.
Okay, I'm gonna try and do this. I know, getting used to technology. Hold on a second. Okay, I'm gonna share the video. So this is the video by Amir Rahman. I think he does a phenomenal job at sort of describing what reverse racism is and what it looks like. So I'm just gonna make sure the sound is on.
Yeah, it's my favorite, one of my favorite videos. Cynthia knows, right? Like I love this video.
Yeah. Okay, can you see you can see the video, YouTube? Okay.
A lot of people don't like my comedy. A lot of white people don't like my comedy. A lot of white people say this to me. Hey, Amir. Hey. You get on stage, you make your jokes about white people. You say white people this, white people that. What if I did something like that, huh? What if I got on stage and I said, yeah, Black people are like this, Muslims are like that. You'd probably call me a racist, wouldn't you? And I say, yeah, I would. Yeah, you should never do that. That's bad for your health. They're like, well, you do that, Amir. You do that. You get on stage, you make your jokes about white people. Don't you think that's a kind of racism? Don't you think that's dun dun dun? Reverse racism. I said, no, I don't think that's reverse racism. Not because I think reverse racism doesn't exist, right? If you ask some Black and brown people, they'll tell you flat out, there is no such thing as reverse racism. I don't agree with that. I think there is such a thing as reverse racism. And I could be a reverse racist if I wanted to. All I would need would be a time machine, right? And what I'd do is I'd get in my time machine, I'd go back in time to before Europe colonized the world, right? And I'd convince the leaders of Africa, Asia, the Middle East, Central and South America to invade and colonize Europe, right? Just occupy them, steal their land and resources, set up some kind of like, I don't know, trans-Asian slave trade where we exported white people to work on giant rice plantations in China. Just ruin Europe over the course of a couple of centuries so all their descendants would want to migrate out and live in the places where Black and brown people come from. But of course, in that time, I'd make sure I set up systems that privilege Black and brown people at every conceivable social, political, and economic opportunity. White people would never have any hope of real self-determination. Just every couple of decades, make up some fake war as an excuse to go and bomb them back to the Stone Age and say it's for their own good because their culture's inferior, and then, just for kicks, subject white people to colored people's standards of beauty, so they end up hating the color of their own skin, eyes, and hair. If, after hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of that, I got on stage at a comedy show and said, hey, what's the deal with white people? Why can't they dance? That would be reverse racism.
Great. Jenny, did you want to say a few words while I set us back up with the PowerPoint?
It is truly my favorite video. It really does explain, like when people use that excuse of reverse racism because like, you know, of what we say, they don't realize truly the systemic nature of what racism is. And like to Cynthia's point, and I will say this, it's not right. It's still not right for us to call, let's say, white people names or our other communities names or to put them down. That's still not right. That's racial discrimination, but it's not racism. And so I think a lot of times taking the time to understand the difference between discrimination and racism, and this video is a really good example of that, is that racism goes to that deep level of like understanding colonization and how it plays out. But I always say discrimination isn't right either. It doesn't give us the right to put other communities down. Like, I want to be really clear about that. It's just not racism. And so it's about understanding what terms mean and where they come from. And like when Cynthia was talking about history as well, and she'll be talking a little bit more about it, it's about that. And we have to be clear about the language that we use. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that video. I love humor. And so his video always makes me laugh.
Yeah, yeah. And so just this last piece, and I'm going to turn it over to Jenny. We'll open it up for some questions, is just this whole concept of anti-Blackness. And so I'm sure it's new for a lot of people. I find that, and I'm just using an example with a lot of Nigerians coming over, Nigerians and Africans, when they come over here, like just this whole concept of Black is a new concept for them, because they're like, well, back home in Nigeria, there was no such thing as Black. Like you just, you know, you were from your regional area, you're Igbo, you know, Hausa, Yoruba, but that was it. So then they come here and then they're racialized, you know, this term of Blackness. And so just to give you an understanding of what it is. So when we speak about anti-Black racism or anti-Blackness, really what we're doing is, you know, we're looking at the policies and practices rooted in Canadian institutions, so education, healthcare, justice, that mirror or reinforce the attitudes, prejudice, stereotyping, and discrimination towards Black people of African descent. And again, it is very different, I think, when you look at, you know, either Blacks in America or Black Canadians. It's a completely different experience. They were brought here through the transatlantic slave trade. And so you do see many of the impacts as a result of colonization and the early beginnings of their history today. Whereas with, you know, Africans, you know, whether coming from the Caribbean, well, I'll say Africa in particular, it's different. So today, when I look at a lot of the Africans coming over, West Africans, Nigerians, Ghanaians, they're doing exceptionally well. They've come with the education. They, you know, have the skills. You know, they've been able to attain a certain level of success that we haven't seen for Black Americans and Black Canadians. And so again, when we look at anti-Blackness, we're looking at the systemic barriers that preside specifically within the original Black Canadian or communities here. Jenny, anything that you wanted to add to that or share? Oh, you're on, just gonna get you to unmute your, you want me to do that? Oh, you got it? Oh. Just get you to unmute yourself, Jenny.
There we go.
There we go.
No, it's all this going back and forth. No, actually, I think that's really good, Cynthia, because I think that, you know, there needs to be an understanding about what is anti-Black racism. So thank you.
Great. So that is it as far as the teaching component. I was going to turn things over to Jenny, and I think we're heading into questions, aren't we?
Yeah, like, well, you know, I wanted to first see if anyone had questions. I know that there's a couple of questions on the chat box that we might think about, but also just in terms of this section, if there were questions that people had of Cynthia and myself too, but in terms of trying to understand really about the concepts of racism. The next part, we're going to talk a little bit about, you know, some questions that Wara had sent to us that, you know, that people were asking. And so we're going to try talking a little bit about it, but, you know, this is an opportunity for people to unmute again, if they want to ask questions, or, you know, if you feel safer or better about putting it in the chat box, please do. And you know, we'll try to answer and keep up with it. And I apologize where I don't remember. Are you going to be looking at the questions and just letting us know what the questions are as well?
No, absolutely. So there's Baba is collating the questions currently. We have some set of questions. While we're waiting for Baba to come on, I was just wondering if you're able to speak to the role of the community. So the, you know, the home, the church community. What's the role that we can play in equipping this younger generation, equipping our youth, our young adults, and even ourselves? We had a question from Pastor Samuel on, you know, how do I navigate through this complexity in the workplace? What are my rights? I just wanted to share very, very quickly the story of a gentleman in I think it was in Toronto. He went into a Chinese restaurant with his friends, and he was told to prepay. And while he looked around, he saw that it was all white in the restaurant, and he went to each and every single person and said, "Were you told to prepay?" And they said no. And so he filed human rights complaints with the Ontario Human Rights Commission. He won the case. He won $10,000. And I think that it's important that people understand that there are human rights laws in Canada and that there are commissions. However, I mean, those are last resort situations. So in terms of equipping people, how do you navigate through these complexities? If you're a young person, what's the role of the church? What's the role of the family, the support system? So over to you, ladies.
Sure. So maybe Jenny, I'll just jump in real quick. So for me, again, as I mentioned at the start of the presentation, we were probably, yeah, like the early Nigerian families that were here. So my parents in the 70s, in the 80s, the Nigerian community back then was very small. Maybe 200 of us. I could be off, but we knew like every Nigerian family. And because, you know, a lot of the Nigerian families back then, they were surviving. It didn't matter. Like, I know sometimes we get into these tribal politics back home, but here, like my parents' closest friends were Yoruba people, like Alsa, and till this day, very close relationships. And so for me, and I was grateful, I don't know if a lot of people know my mom. So my mom, she passed away 9 years ago, but Monica Okafor was her name. And she was very instrumental with a few other Nigerian women, like Moji Taiwo is someone that I think of. And they had started, it was the first Nigerian Women's Association back in the 80s. And it was an opportunity for us to network. And because most of us kids, when we went to school, we were surrounded by whites. In our community, we were surrounded by whites. You know, whenever the Nigerian community would organize gatherings, Christmas parties, picnics, it was a way for us to be among our people, you know, to have that sense of identity, to have that closeness to our culture. And I am so grateful for that opportunity. If it wasn't for that, I wouldn't be who I am today. And it's funny because, you know, a lot of people joke around when they meet me, fellow Nigerians. They either say, "Oh, well, you're the lost one," or "Do you not identify with being Nigerian? Are you not proud?" I am very proud, you know, but again, I think that's part of the ignorance because I was born here and I sound like this. They think there's no connection. But I can't deny the fact that I was born here. But again, I am very proud of who I am. And I have 2 kids. My daughter's 11, my son is 6. And I take them around to different cultural events. We go to the Yoruba picnic. We go to the Igbo picnic, we go to the gala because I want them to have that connection. And so I believe very much in having that tie back to your history or who you are as a people. It is so important.
So my head spins a lot of times with this question because there's so many things that we could be doing and so many things that we have control over and we don't have control over. So I'll try to group them in some kind of meaningful way. So Ura knows that that I have a very strong connection to my faith. So I am a practicing Catholic, and really so much of how I respond goes back to my faith. And so I keep reminding myself, one ways, and I'm going to talk about many, but one way that helps me cope with racism and what happens to me is that I constantly remind myself of a couple of things. And one is that Jesus never promised me a perfect life. Okay, so that is one thing that I always say right from the start. He's not promised me a perfect life, but he's kind of wondering what I'm going to do with my life, right? And then how I honor my responsibilities. A fundamental piece of ours is about forgiveness, right? And reconciliation. And so it is about, like, I see life challenges as an opportunity to practice my faith. I know that sounds weird, right? But it's really important to me because I keep reminding myself over and over again, not promised a perfect life. And it is my responsibility to forgive and to do, even if a person didn't apologize. It is something that I'm being asked to do. Not easy, but so I do turn to my faith, and I do pray. When I'm struggling, prayer is something that's really meaningful. Okay, so that being said, because I want to be clear about that, that's probably my number one strategy. Number two is that, in workplaces, we'll go to workplaces. In workplaces, it can be really challenging because there are times where we have gone to our managers, we've gone to the right places to complain or to, talk about racism that's going on. But it's, sometimes it can be really hard, right? Like, the way people treat you in a meeting, how they underestimate you or they don't listen to you. It's hard to be able to prove that, right? We know in our gut it's happening. Some people ask me, how do you know? Oh, you feel it, right? Like trust yourself, because if you're feeling it, you've had a lifetime of this, you'll know it, right? Like I know when my mother's looking at me and judging me, right? Like I know it without her saying anything. You also know it when it's happening in the office place, right? And so many times it's hard depending on how supportive your supervisors are. If you don't have supportive supervisors, which I'll be honest with you, I haven't had a lot of supportive supervisors in my working time. I do look to my friends, right? My friends are really important. So Cynthia is a very, very close friend of mine. And so I always feel blessed that I have the opportunity to talk to people who have shared experience, right? Shared values. And I really do look to my friends, my close friends, to be able to talk about this. My white friends don't get this. As much as they have the best of intentions, they haven't lived it. And so it's different. So what we did in the Indian community, for instance, we would have like, a South Asian, we call it the South Asian Professional Network. Actually, that's how I met my spouse, believe it or not. But it was just like, it was an opportunity for us to come together to talk about our experiences, but also to support each other in terms of our career, anything like that. We really bonded. I actually met a lot of great people in my life as a result of that. I also think as parents, like I was, if you remember my story, I was pretty scared of my parents. And so I didn't feel secure in going to them. So as a parent now, I have a 13-year-old and a 10-year-old. The thing that I make sure is that I am there. So I will ask questions. Like I don't just let them come to me. Many times I will have conversations one-on-one, right? And just ask how they're doing, right? Like, what are their friendships like? How are they feeling in school? Like I start the conversation. I'm the adult after all, right? And sometimes they don't have words for it. They don't understand what's going on. When my daughter used to say to me, she wished that she had blonde hair, right? Like she wanted to be more white. She would say these things and I would be like, okay, we need to have a conversation about how beautiful she is, right? And just, so it's about, as parents, believing our children, number one, right? So, and as a friend as well, it's like not to, I always say, make excuses for the others. Nothing frustrates me more than when I'm talking about a situation of racism and my friend or my family member or my colleague will tell me, yeah, but, that's that whole thing. Yeah, but they're a really nice person, Jenny. Like, I'm not saying that they're not a nice person. It doesn't still negate the fact that how I'm feeling is real, and to honor that. So as communities, as churches, as family members, we need to listen. One of the things I say to so many people, and I apologize for this, but I always say, like, shut up and listen sometimes. That is our job, is to listen. and truly believe. And if it's just a feeling that a person has, well, yeah, that we honor that feeling, right? Like we know that, and to be a good friend in that respect. Our church has such an important role, as I said, in this, is because, as I said, it's our time to sit and think about how as a community we can work together. We're not saying it's right, but it's also about understanding what is our faith asking us to do. So, when Wara talked about Michelle Obama, when people go low, you go high, you make sure you go high, right? Because it's the right thing to do, right? And so however you conduct yourself, even I used to always say, you fight with compassion, right? You don't fight with anger, you fight with compassion, right? And I don't know, it gives you a totally different way of being in this work. And that's been really critical for me, is to always think about compassion, about my faith and what I'm being asked to, and then to honor that as I continue to fight in social justice. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you so much, ladies. So I'm just gonna come in for a second and just quickly go to one comment we have from Facebook regarding workplace, and it says, assessing the safety of your organization to determine when to talk. Don't be voiceless, but do it intelligently. So that's one comment we have from Facebook. And then, so we have questions in the chat. Maybe this has been addressed in a way, but one said, my daughter works in a restaurant and a woman comes in and says, I didn't know Black people work here. My 3 daughters are the only ones that work there. And the same person also had a post about, can teachers use the word nigger when teaching in CBE schools? A teacher repeatedly used it and made her so uncomfortable. Is that right? So I think these are the 2 that we have for now. We do have a bunch of questions we would be looking at the end. Yeah, I just wanted to chip that in, and then we can carry on at this point.
I was going to say, Cynthia, do you want this one? You want to start?
Yeah, so maybe with the CBE comment, because that's been coming up quite a bit. With certain works that have been used. To Kill a Mockingbird was a book that was used. That was when I think it must have been junior high, early junior high. And, that's the challenge I find. And then again, when you look at the makeup of the school system, 70% of the teachers teaching our kids are white. Okay, so can you imagine these teachers teaching on content dealing with race, but they have no background. And that's what we found when we were reading or working with certain works, certain books, is that the teachers, they didn't do a good job in terms of prefacing the content or the conversation. And so I think it's important for our teachers, I think, to get to that place of feeling comfortable and having those conversations about race and racism. And so this is why, again, I advocate very strongly for decolonizing our curriculum, introducing culturally appropriate curriculum. And you know what, and I might as well say it, I pray for that day that we get to the point where, we have more diverse teachers working within the school system. There is no reason, and I have a lot of friends that are teachers. My mom was an educator as well. They are always designated substitute teaching positions. You will never find them working in full-time positions. And I think that's wrong. And this is why I encourage parents, get involved within the school system if you can. The system here is different. It's not like back home where you send your children off to school and that's it. Here is a little bit different where, there's that expectation that parents, and that's if you have the time, but parents will get involved. They know what is happening within the school. So, I mean, if you can get involved with your school board, if you can volunteer, it's critical. I know I've been very active in my children's school. They go to a Catholic school. I take the time, I volunteer. And because I have a presence, I've been able to kind of shape curriculum to a certain extent. We have the standard curriculum, but the principal has made an exception to have me come in and to do a bit of, like the one-off workshops and to do a bit of teaching to supplement what the school is already doing. So I think your presence matters and your voice certainly matters.
I was going to add, Cynthia, like absolutely, right? And I think there's a piece about language, and and when is it appropriate to use words and not, and as a person who's not a member of the community, number one, like kind of first and foremost, nobody's given you permission to use the words, right? So if you haven't done the work, but you don't also have lived experience, I'm sorry, but I have a really strong opinion about this, in that you don't have my permission to use words to refer to our community in a derogatory way, right? Unless you've done, like I said, you've talked to me, you've talked to, let's say the Black and Brown people of your school or your class, and you have to do some work before you can use language. So this teacher, has he or she done the work to understand the significance of that term? Like, why is that term so problematic? And I know, Cynthia, you and I wanted, as part of the discussion, and we might as well bring it up right now, is like, why is that term? And as I said, and I don't use the term because I haven't been given permission by the community and I'm not a member of the community. So I will not use the term because it is so derogatory and I think it perpetuates anti-Black racism, right? And so, Cynthia, do you want to talk a little bit about why that term is loaded?
Yeah. Why don't I do that? Because I know it also comes up in music. So the term nigger, and if you listen to proponents of the term, there's just sort of this sense that, we're empowering the term, we're taking the term back within the Black community. And often boundaries set in place around who can use the term versus who cannot use it. So people will say, well, I'm Black, I'm out of the Black community, I've taken it back, I can use the term, you don't have permission to use it. Now, quite frankly, I don't think anybody should be using the term. If you have studied, the role of, the transatlantic slave movement, the experiences of Blacks, especially during the Jim Crow era in America, you wouldn't use the term. And sadly, our kids are coming up and they're growing up in a time where they're being influenced by music, a lot of the music that they're listening to, and they have no meaning. There's no significance of the term to them. You have kids, this was outside of the building that one of our satellite offices at the city. And I happened to walk out. There's a group of youth that were hanging around and referring to each other as nigger. And I stopped them. I'm like my mom. My mom's spirit lives on within me, but I stopped them. And, they must have thought, who's this crazy woman? But I did a bit of education. I said, you kids shouldn't be using the term. Like, do you know where that term comes from? And so that's why, again, I go back to the importance of history, these kids knowing who they are, knowing the history, because I can guarantee a lot of the kids coming up today, there's just no connection, there's no grounding, no knowledge of the significance of language, the terms they use, whether it has to do with racial terms or gender. That's another problem as well. When we look at the role that gender plays and the role, the treatment of women and young girls, that's a whole other subject, but anyway.
Yeah, and I think we have to be really careful about that, right? Like language, like I know people talk about reclaiming the word, but there's such, I mean, as I said, if you understand the word, right? I don't understand what we're reclaiming, right? Like if we want to go to a place of like the word wasn't offensive, but it was used to oppress people. And then there's other words like in our community too. And I'm like, all you're doing actually is perpetuating the problem that we're trying to solve. I think it was Maya Angelou. I watched recently a documentary about Maya Angelou, who also is a person that I admired. And I always say I was really fortunate to listen to her before she passed away. But one of the things, she used to get really angry at people when they use such disrespectful language. And she's like, no, you're not reclaiming anything, yeah. Right? You need to show respect for yourself and your community. And so language like that is not doing that. So, it's about respect and honoring who you are. And as I said, I have strong opinions about this because, as I said, the language, I went through this too when I was younger. I mean, Paki, right, is the word that was always used against us. And, and we used to toss it around like it was nothing, right? now I look back and I think, oh, geez, that wasn't right, right? And other words too. And so it's really important, as younger people, as people even of our age, that we need to stop that. Like, and just language is so dynamic, and we need to understand the power of language and how it actually impacts the people around us. And yeah, and to be really mindful of that.
Thank you very much, Lady.
Okay.
I just before I pass on to Sister Baba, I just want to say that we do have leaders of our community online. And so I just want to encourage people to just put in the chat box, either you're on Facebook or on Zoom, put in the chat box the kind of support that you're looking from your community that will help establish you and help you to be grounded and rooted. And then the second thing I just want to quickly share, it's not in the question, but I've had a lot of conversations since this movement started in May with a lot of white folks. And one of the things that I'm hearing from them is they want to have that dialogue. So in the scenario that the pastor shared with us a couple of minutes ago, it is very possible that it's the fear of not knowing what to say, the fear of offending, the fear of people are treading very carefully now. How can we, what's the messaging? Should somebody who is white, who is interested in this topic, who is interested in being part of the movement? I was particularly excited when I saw people from all walks of life during the Calgary protests joining in that movement. And so there are people who are very much vested and interested in advancing this. And so what's the message for them to help shift them from that fear-based mindset to a learning, making mistakes, failing forward, and into that growth mindset where, people begin to change behavior? What's the message you will share with someone like that? Thank you.
Yeah. So,
Okay.
Oh, do you want to go ahead, Jenny?
I can start, but it's up to you. Like
Sure, go ahead.
I was gonna say, we have this neat thing called Google, and Google really can do a lot for you. It's time for people to do a little bit of research out there before it is constantly placed on us to teach them. I mean, I do a ton of teaching, and so sometimes people are like, I want to learn. Okay, well, Google it. Google. There's so much on Google, and as white people, they can go to to their white. If they want to hear it from a white person, go to Tim Wise. There are people who talk about white privilege. Robin DiAngelo, said they all talk about it. So you know what? Spend a couple of hours, go watch a couple of YouTube videos before you come back to me. Because sometimes I think that people like to ask the question, but they haven't really done any work. And they're kind of like, oh, Jenny, you will just teach me, but they don't take any responsibility for themselves. So I always say, yeah, go onto YouTube. There's some really great people that speak, and also like Google Talks. There's some really good Google Talks out there, and you can start there. I also think that we need to stop worrying, a lot of people are just so scared to talk that it's paralyzing them. And I always say, once you kind of Google, you can come and talk to me, but really think about why you're asking me the questions in the first place. So one thing I actually resent a lot of times is when white people come and ask me to share my story. I don't share my story very often. So today I shared it, but it was different. But when white people ask me to share my story, I'm very hesitant. And the reason is because, what is it? Are you hearing my story so you could feel bad for me for about 5-10 minutes, and then you go on with your, ordinary life? I am tired of always having the responsibility of sharing my story to them so that they could feel bad for 5 or 10 minutes and then go on with their regular lives. I always challenge actually at the city, and nobody seems to want to listen to me sometimes, but my big challenge to them right now is, how about this? Instead of me sharing my story, why don't you share your story of white privilege? Why don't you think about how you have benefited from being white and how you've perpetuated racism? Why don't you share that story? Instead of always asking the responsibility on me, I have challenged our Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Committee at the city. I have challenged them with that. I'm tired of telling our stories to which it goes nowhere. And so why don't we start asking our workplaces Why don't you reflect on your white privilege, on your white fragility? Why don't you reflect on that and share that story and you know, and how you've perpetuated the problem, and maybe we could have a real conversation. So anyway, that's just one thought. I have so many as usual. Cynthia, what are your thoughts? I can rant.
See, it's sort of mixed for me. And what changed my perspective on the experiences of white people is reading the work of Robin DiAngelo. So this is the book, if you ever get a chance to read it. I can put it in chat, White Fragility, and I've read some of her other works as well. And Robin DiAngelo often speaks about, you know, this social position. Yeah, there we go, Jenny. The social positions in which we find ourselves. You know, and the unfortunate reality with white people is, even though they are complicit with, you know, the system of racism, when you go back to socialization, the way they were raised, you know, a lot of them, when they tell you that, well, we didn't grow up, you know, ever talking about race. I saw everybody as being the same. Color didn't matter. Believe them, because it's true. And I do believe that, you know, even though we live in a fairly diverse nation, we are really quite segregated when you think about it. And so when you have, you know, a white person, you look at them, you know, their social networks, their social surroundings, they are, you know, their family is white. When they step out into the world, they are surrounded by white people within their schools. They go to the doctor's office, they're surrounded by white people. And so it's no wonder that when it comes to the topic of racism, there's no understanding. And so I think that it's tough. Some people may disagree, but I think we as racialized folks need to create an environment where we can have healthy dialogue, right? And so because, you know, the one thing that I have seen is, you know, white people have been in spaces and settings, training sessions where the topic comes up, and then that immediate attack by the community. And I don't think that's an effective approach. If we're going to get anywhere with racism, dismantling the structures, then we need to create, you know, that safe environment or brave space in order to have the conversation. Same thing with me. I think we need to get over, you know, this whole idea of, you know, being fearful to have the conversations or making mistakes. We're going to make mistakes. I make mistakes, right? That's just, it's part of it. And so I think we need to create that environment so we can have healthy dialogue. It doesn't matter who you are.
I think, like Cynthia, like I totally understand what you're saying. And a lot of times when people, like when I do sessions, especially with white people, when they ask me to come in to talk about racism or cultural competency, I'll usually say right from the start, you can ask me any question, no matter how stupid it is. I've given you permission to ask whatever question it is. And I promise you, without judgment, I will answer the questions, right? And so I do that a lot, right? In my, you know, my workshops, you know, I'll let them know. So I'm open to the conversation. But as I said, like before, I do also think that there's such a fear of being like seen as good, and that people are paralyzed to ask the questions. But it's also how we ask the questions, and you know, and there has to be some work there. Like, you know, so yeah, we take on a lot of responsibility as people of color. But sometimes I wonder what is the responsibility also of the white community to take on some responsibility, right? Like we have to do a dual approach, and I feel like it's quite one-sided right now.
Well,
so, right, like I just, and so we do a lot of it, you know, when it's convenient for them. Like, you know, we'll have a diversity and inclusion day or something, and it's one, like you said, to your point, 1 month is considered Black History Month. Like right now at the city too, like I'm finding people want to talk about it now, but you know, I'll be curious, give it a month or two and see if the same interest is there. I don't know, but it's just, it's challenging, but we do have to be open to the conversation, and I'm open to the conversation if it's coming from a place of true learning, and I'm good with that.
Yeah, and I was just going to jump in and say, you know, like you do have a lot of educators and theorists that are out there. You know, I mentioned Robin DiAngelo is one of them. There's like Tim Wise. There's so many others that are sort of, they've immersed themselves. It's this field or study called whiteness, the study of whiteness. And so there are, yeah, these white educators that are educating white people on racism, and they are doing the work. But what I do find that's problematic is that, you know, Black people, racialized people have been doing this work as far back as you can remember. But it's these educators, you know, these experts, these white experts that are benefiting. They're making loads of money in this area. And so, which is why, as much as I love Robin DiAngelo as a white educator, I try hard not to promote her books. There's another book by a young woman, I believe she's East African, Layla Sahad, Me and White Supremacy, or yeah, Me and White Supremacy. So it's like a 28, 29-day guide in terms of, you know, understanding, you know, racism and other forms of oppression. And so I've been doing more of that, promoting Black and racialized educators, because oftentimes, and I find this with myself, I've been doing this work a long time, but I'm often asked, or Jenny and I are asked to volunteer our time. We know our worth, we know our value, we should get paid as much as, you know, some of the white educators that are out there doing the work, but they often get hired on. I don't know what it is, maybe because it's safer. You know, the message, it's something that resonates for white people, but I think that's something to be cautious of when it comes to work in this area.
Totally. I totally agree with you, Cynthia. Like, you know, but sometimes, you know, like that whole question is like, you know, who do people listen to? And it is interesting when like Tim Wise, Robin DiAngelo, the kind of respect they have for their work, but then there are others that are like amazing as well, right? And why are we not looking to them to speak at events, and to your point, not pay them as well? So it's challenging. And even who leads the work in your organizations. I have a real issue, you know, in our diversity and inclusion work at our various organizations, who's actually leading the work, and where are our communities in that? And it's usually in some kind of minor background singer role. And I really have issues with that as well.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So at this point, I'm going to be putting some comments and questions together that I pretty much think have a central theme running through them. For the benefit of those on Facebook, I'm going to add some comments from the chat. So I'm going to start with Black history should be taught in schools, and the curriculum should be written by well-seasoned Black scholars to avoid bias. And we also have, I think it's important to note that diversity can be measured, put on a graph, but inclusion is how people feel. There is a lag between what the government's policy drives versus what the citizens want or embrace. The government is driving diversity for economic reason amongst other, but not so much inclusiveness, and perhaps they do not know how to. And we have this question: what big constitutional changes can be made to affect racism, and how can we make that happen?
Yeah, so maybe I'll speak real quickly to the second one in terms of constitutional changes. So if any of you have been following the notice of motion that was put forth by City Council around anti-racism, the events of the last week is a perfectly good example. You know, so where the City of Calgary City Council put out this call for the public to come and share their voice, their stories on their experiences with racism, and to drive political agenda within this area. And let me tell you, the community showed up. It wasn't perfect. You know, Jenny and I laugh about it. You know, I think lots of learnings that came from that. But boy, did, you know, racialized Calgarians, Indigenous, Black show up. And this is what we need. I often use the example, this was in Falcon Ridge when they were extending the C train line. So if you go into Falcon Ridge, there's a C train that cuts right in to the community. So there's houses, when you go outside, you're literally looking at the C train, like right in your backyard. And it's unfortunate. I was around the city. I think I started with the city around that time. And, you know, I can guarantee if there's a proposal to put a C train line within an affluent community in the Southwest, Mount Royal, Aspen, it would not happen, you know. So that's the one thing, you know, civic participation is so important. We tend to see it, you know, with white Calgarians, they're involved with their political, or what is it, their community association. They're involved with politics, they know what's going on. So, and, you know, with the public consultations on anti-racism, that was the first time that we saw people register, get involved, and even just learn about how our political process works. So, you know, if you want to make change, you know, you need to participate civically. It's so important. Jenny.
Oh, again, so many thoughts that are going in my head. So let me talk first about getting involved, and then I'd like to touch on the diversity and inclusion piece. You know, absolutely, it is really important to get involved. And in this last week with the public consultation on anti-racism, it was great that the number of people who participated, like we had over 150 people participate, and that was fantastic. The questions that I think we should also be asking ourselves is that, you know, why is it that our communities don't participate in political processes, in community processes? And I think there is partly is our responsibility, like, you know, as communities, but what is the responsibility of the institutions and the government? And that's my work actually, is what are we doing as a government to ensure that our communities can participate? Right. And so, like, what barriers do we have in place that people then cannot participate? And like, so I will say, who benefits from these existing processes and who doesn't? I would argue most people didn't even know how to register for this in the first place. And if it wasn't for very intentional work by members of the community to show people, like, you know, how to register, people wouldn't have known how to do it. Because I'll tell you, the communications from the city was horrific, right? And so, like, I mean, one of many things, right? Like, you know, there was that whole idea of 5 minutes to speak, things like that. And so, and you know, and they had talked about also, there was a Black woman who needed sign language, right? Like, what type of interpreter, you know, would she need to be able to talk about what she needed? So it is our responsibility as a government, as well as institutions, other institutions, to look at what processes exist and what's stopping people from actually participating in our community association and in our government processes. So I'm really grateful, but I always think, man, could you imagine other people who could have been involved because, let's say, they didn't have access to the technology that was required. They didn't have 5-6 hours to sit on the phone waiting for their turn to participate because they actually had to work, right? You know, like things like that, that we need to start questioning and challenging our governments to be better. And so I'm really personally hoping, as we move forward, not only at a local government, provincially and federally, is truly looking at our processes and understanding how, like, who's excluded and why, and what do we need? What wall do we need to get rid of so that people can participate? So that's kind of my interpretation. While I liked the process, there were so many people who showed up. The process was riddled with problems for me, and I really struggled with how we conducted it, because it was very white. It was very like our typical white dominated, you know, meetings. And so did that really, like, I mean, I think the process showed, you know, racism actually at its best. That's number one. Number two, diversity and inclusion. So, you know, it's interesting. I have a real issue with diversity and inclusion. And so, yes, you're right. Diversity to me is like the number of raisins in your cereal. That's how I kind of explain it. You know, it makes your cereal, I guess, taste pretty decent. Inclusion is how people are involved. But honest to God, I have been in this work for a long time now, and diversity and inclusion has only benefited, really, in my opinion, one group of people, and that is white women. White women have benefited absolutely from diversity and inclusion, and they're the only group that has. But the rest of us haven't. We still have very racist policies. We're not an anti-racist organizations, and we're not free. Right. And so, and like but you know, it's interesting about language, because, you know, when you look at the work I do at the city, my pillar is called Inclusive Futures. I didn't even want it to be Inclusive Futures, but I had to keep that name because that was what City Council could absorb. That was the best. Like, in order for my work to be passed, I had to word things in such a way that they would say yes to. But I'm not actually working in inclusion. I want to push us to justice. I want to push us to, like, looking at systemic oppression and even at the very least equity. So equity actually really does look at what are those barriers that are preventing people from participating, and what is our role in taking down those barriers. Inclusion means we love everyone. Oh my God, I love everyone. My best friend is Black, therefore I can't possibly be racist. Look how inclusive I am, right? Like it's all, but it says nothing. It just says that, you know, we all love each other. But if you truly ask people, you know, how many Black people do they have in their lives if they're white or even brown, right? Like how many people do I have as friends that are Indigenous, truly friends, not the person I see at the water cooler and, you know, and chit chat a little bit, but are truly friends of mine, right? And so inclusion doesn't address that. It just says that, hey, you know, and this whole unconscious bias stuff also, it just places like no responsibility on ourselves to do the work, right? And so it really is about taking it to that next place and saying what are those systemic barriers, and then what is our role in working in these systems to take those barriers down. Yeah. And then like, you know, like, I mean, God, I would love for us to actually have a real conversation of anti-racism, not just racial equity. But, you know, step by step we get there.
Yeah, and, oh, sorry, Jenny. Great.
No, go ahead, go
yeah,
ahead.
and the challenge I find with diversity and inclusion, it's often loaded, it's safe. And what you'll find, you know, with many of the organizations that we work in is, you know, organizations are good at having, you know, policies in place and value statements, but they don't implement. The implementation is lacking. So they, you know, they have it in place, it looks good, they have, you know, or specs of diversity. And so I think the real challenge that I find with anti-racism work is that it forces us to really unpack our policies, the institutions, and really take a look at what's happening. I was fortunate to attend a session recently in Edmonton it was the Center for Race and Culture. And so it is a diversity and inclusion. There's an equity focus as well. It's their organizational assessment. And so it really forces us to take a look at the ways we are embedding equity within our organizations, everything from leadership, governance, HR, you know, staff, frontline, you name it. And I think that's the place we need to get to. You know, we need to find a way of incorporating this work and embedding it all throughout the organization. We often talk about it with politics, like if city council were to leave, you know, we get a new council members come next year with the elections. You know, if we've done our job right and we've embedded, you know, practices of equity and anti-racism into the organization, when council leaves, new council comes in, it shouldn't matter because it's a part of the way we do business. It's a part of our culture. And I feel like that's the place that we need to get to.
I was also like I wanted to also throw in another question, where I hope that that's okay. Like just, you know, and I'm sure working in HR, you hear this a lot because I know I hear it a lot. Especially when you're in the workplace. We say that we hire for meritocracy, right? You know, like we always hear this statement that no, we hire because we only hire the best. And I know we're virtual and it's really hard to be able to see like the number of people who've probably heard the reason why they didn't get a job was because of meritocracy and that they only hire the best for the job. You know, as I said, and I wish I could have do a poll just to see how many people have heard that ridiculous excuse of meritocracy. And what's actually being said or done. And I used to always say, you know, I would love for my white colleagues to be asked that same question. Like, you know, or it's said to them, well, we only, you know, we hire only the best, right? You know, because I'm surrounded by mediocre white people, like genuinely surrounded by mediocre white people. And I don't know why no one questions their competencies, their education, right? Like I've got 2 degrees and a master's behind me. Plus I have like 20 years of work experience in a variety of systems. And so why are you still asking me what my qualifications are when I can clearly demonstrate it? And so it bothers me when, like, you know, and this is something I wonder if people also like say to their children, or you have heard yourself from your parents, is that you have to be extraordinary. Like I tell my children, you have to be 5-6 times better than the average white guy that's beside you to get like half of the opportunities that guy gets. That is the reality. Like we cannot, I tell my girls, they hate it. They roll their eyes at me all the time. But I'm like, you cannot afford to be average. If you are average, you are going nowhere fast. I'm just telling you that right now in the work world. Like Cynthia and I have had to prove ourselves to be extraordinary to get a position that, you know, like as I said, an average white guy can do with nothing, right? Like, you know, like if they had qualifications that Cynthia and I had, we would be the general managers of the organization by now. I swear to God. But that's not how it works. And so meritocracy is just code, in my opinion, for other white people to just hire people that look like them and sound like them.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and you know, and just real quick to jump in, like I think we have to ask ourselves when that comes up, meritocracy, you know, and it's being thrown in our faces, what is really being said? And so I think back to I had it was an assessment, it was a meeting that I had with one of my organizations, and I had asked them about, you know, just diversity and representation at the board level. And that's what I got. That was the response. Well, you know, we hire based on merit here, you know, education, you need to have the skills, you need to, you know, all of it. And I'm thinking, so then what are you really trying to tell me? Because, you know, it's this belief and idea that a lot of white people carry. If you go back to affirmative action policies, equity, you know, there's this belief that, well, we are choosing racialized people with no skills, no education over a white person with the skills and education, and that is not the case. Those policies, you still needed to have the education, skills, experience, but what we were looking at was more representation. So when that comes up, I encourage you as audience members to really challenge that.
Yeah, because like that's exactly right, Cynthia. Like, you know, and I think Wara can probably speak far more intelligently than we can on this. But the whole idea about affirmative action is really about when all skills are the same, you hire the person of color to, you know, increase your diversity or to achieve those numbers. But I would argue that if this is a person of color and this is the white person, we are actually up here, they're down here, and we're still trying to prove ourselves to get hired. It's not this. I always think that we're expected to be extraordinary. These guys, nobody's actually questioning their competencies or level. They just have to show an interest in the job and they get it, right? And so there's a real problem. And a lot of people will say to me, well, Jenny, you know, you got the job only because you were brown, right? Like, you know, they're trying to fill their quota. And I'm always sitting there going, what did you have to prove to show that you were qualified for this job? Again, I'm surrounded by mediocrity. And so, like, apparently you got the job for doing nothing. Nobody asks you or questions you, but you seem to feel the right to question me for why I got my job. And so it's interesting. And like I said, a lot of times I'll ask that question because, like, I think as I'm getting older, and I'll admit it, I'm getting tired. I'm tired of these excuses that people give me. And so I'm just going to ask questions back and wonder how they got their job too, right? And just start having that, like, challenging people's thinking. And sometimes in meetings with HR, I've been in, like, you know, group meetings, and somebody will, you know, use that term, yeah, we only hire the best mediocrity. I said, we have to stop this myth. We have to stop saying this because we are not doing that. So let's stop talking like that. And, you know, and because I'm tired. I'm just tired of that being the excuse.
Yeah, and even just to, I want to focus on name for a moment, because this is, you know, one thing that we saw with the city council consultations. So, you know, we have the moderator, the host of the meeting, one of the counselors who was just butchering people's names. We had a whole professor, Dr. Francis Boyche, who's from Ghana, you know, despite his education and his credentials, you know, the host or the moderator got his name wrong and nothing was said. And this took place all throughout these proceedings. And so I really want to challenge you to force people to start saying your names. Force them. If they have to write it phonetically, if they have to just listen for a moment, force them. Because here, if you can have, you know, Canadians, you know, just rifle off the names of NHL players or other sports players, then they should be able to do the same thing when it comes to your names. So that's one thing that I really challenge the participants.
Yeah, and it was interesting during that when we heard one other city council who was a member of like people of color who basically, you know, talked about how grateful we should be to be in this country in the first place, right? Like, you know, and he used that whole multiculturalism argument that we should just be grateful, like, you know, that this country accepted us, my God, right? You know, and he went on about that, and I was really disappointed because, you know, like, it's just, that's not the message that we're trying to get. Of course, we're happy to be here, but it doesn't mean that we're perfect. And so we heard that quite a bit, which I was really challenged with that. And I hear this also in the workplace. You should just be grateful that you have the job that you have, right? And I'm like, oh, no, I have earned exactly, I've earned where I'm at. And I wish that you would have had to do the same thing to get the same position.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm just going to take another set of questions. I hope that would not be our last, though. A few of these questions are actually from the teens, I believe, and the youth. So the first says, why are Black celebrities treated better than regular Black people? And there's also the perception of racism. Do you think at times we may perceive we are being victimized because of our race when someone of a different color mistreats us? For example, if a Caucasian person were to say something rude to or mistreat a person of color, some would say it is because of the color of their skin. It is because of the color of their skin that they are being disrespected, when in reality, the Caucasian might just have had a bad day or does the same to others of their race. What are your thoughts on that? And then there's also the question of, do you think racism will ever end?
Okay. So maybe I'll take the second question. And so I think we need to assess intent, you know, when we are interacting with people. And so not everything is about race, not everything is about racism, but you know, if I'm interacting, you know, with a white person and, you know, they get upset with me, they get angry and they refer to me as a nigger, well, then of course it's racism, you know, but they could be having a bad day. You know, we get into a back and forth, a match with each other. It may not necessarily be about racism. So I think within those moments, I think it's important to assess intent. And I do encourage, I've worked in the school system as well. And, you know, I think I do caution our youth, you know, to be cautious with when you would bring up race or accusations of race. And so I think it's left up to us to really, so again, we've taken you through a whole learning of what racism is, what it looks like. And I think the same thing needs to be done with our youth. They need to have a firm understanding of what racism is, what it looks like. So that way they're equipped to challenge it within the appropriate moment.
Yeah, and yeah, of course, there's always jackasses out there, right? Like, no matter what their skin color is. Like, I mean, you know, like, of course that exists, right? Like, I mean, you know, so we do see that, but we have also been seeing lately, right? People videotaping a response from somebody who will say that they're not racist, but then they will say some pretty offensive things to people, right? And then, like, sometimes their character really does come out, and they're you know, like who they are as people. So you're right, Cynthia, like yeah, absolutely, not everything is about racism, of course not, but a lot of times it's how they approach you, how they talk, what language that they use. And again, it's a feeling you get. Like, you know, sometimes it's just trusting that feeling that, you know, that it's, you know, is this guy just a jackass, or is, you know, also part of it is being a racist on top of it, right? So there is something to think about it. Will racism ever end? Well, that is a great question. I mean, I wouldn't be in this work if I thought that it was never going to end. So I do have hope. You know, I used to say this, and, you know, I've changed kind of my analogy over time, but I used to say, if we were able to put a person on the moon, right? And, you know, we collectively came together, like the US at the time, and we put a person on the moon, we can do this, right? Like we can. And, you know, and so how do we get there? I genuinely believe we have to start working together. And that means all of our communities have to come together, right? And so when you think about white supremacy and who, like, you know, like the evil, like what is that evil force? If we as communities, our Indigenous communities, our Black communities, our brown communities, like we have to come together and you know, and fight our common enemy, actually. And we keep being divided. I think that part of the work is that we as communities have to do some healing. We do, right? I think that a lot of this work takes us, like Ina said, our communities to come together, talk about our experiences amongst ourselves. It's not about sharing it with, with the white communities or city council, but we need an opportunity to heal, because there's a lot of healing that's required. And I think that as communities, we need that brave and safe space for us to genuinely talk about like the experiences of racism and our impacts to racism. Let's not worry about solutions yet. Look, we need some time to tell our truth. You think about truth and reconciliation. Well, truth is such a big part of this. And so if we can take some time, talking about our truth, take that time. I think white people have work to do too, right? So like when it comes to, understanding their internalized dominance, if they can start talking about white supremacy, they need to start talking about this, right? And they need to do that in their own space. Like, go do it, right? We need to heal. You need to do some work on yourselves and understand your power and privilege, unearned power and privilege. I think once that work is happening, I think then the communities can finally come together where we can talk our truth. We can then collectively come up with solutions to start tackling racism. But some work needs to be done. And, so it's just our communities, as I said, my biggest thing, and Cynthia and I talk about this all the time, we need to stop fighting with each other, and we need to start coming together, all of our communities, Indigenous, Black, Brown communities, we need to come together and start doing this, because imagine the force we would be. Like, we would be unstoppable, right? If we would let go of a lot of that, like, the stuff that we do to each other, if we could let go of that, man, who would stop us, right? But anyway, that's just my thoughts about can we end racism or not?
Yeah, and I think that's the important role that I feel the faith community plays. Because when I look at, so again, using the example of, being Nigerian, it's very different times that we're living in now versus the 80s, where it didn't matter who you were. We were forced to come together simply on the basis of survival, but then now within the Nigerian community, there's the South group over here, there's the Yoruba Association, there's the Igbo Association, there's the Anambra Association, and I think that can be a bit problematic, and it forces us at thriving based on our differences rather than coming together. And so with the faith group or the faith communities, it doesn't matter, who you are, it doesn't matter where you come from. And so I think there's an important role to continue to play by faith communities in terms of bringing the community together.
Yeah, so I think your last point just pretty much addressed one of the questions from the last set. So I would have two more to go. And the first one says, what can teens do in this day and age to help the Black Lives Matters movement? And then also, I think we should talk about how gender plays a part on how people treat Black individuals. We should talk about how Black people view themselves, ways we can dismantle the stereotypes of Black people. So I see a theme in there about gender. So maybe you can speak to that also.
Yeah, so maybe I can start with the youth. It's kind of interesting because I worked, when I started in my career as a social worker, I started as a youth social worker. And it's interesting because when you look at all these leadership opportunities, it seems to be it's white children holding up the space. Rarely do we see our Black children taking up leadership opportunities. And I can't tell you, I think it is so important. The city of Calgary, has a really good leadership program, opportunities for youth to volunteer, but Black youth are not. I hardly see Black youth. And once you volunteer, it sort of streamlines you into that opportunity to work for the corporation with our youth programs, and they pay very well. And so I think as a starting point, when it comes to our youth, I think just in general, get involved with your community, volunteer, get involved with politics, know what's happening in the world. And when it comes to the Black Lives Matter movement in particular, there's so many organizations that are doing work. There's the Cultural Mosaic Foundation. They have tons of youth that are working for that particular organization, and being a voice of the cause. And so I would like to see a way for, our youth to just get involved in general and build their capacity when it comes to leadership. And I can, I have someone, I guess, in chat that is asking about more opportunities. And so what I can do is I can maybe I'll just put together a list of different organizations and then the programs at the city that you can take advantage of. I'll do that.
Yeah, I was going to say, a couple of comments. Yeah, I was going to say that, Cynthia, if you could talk about those opportunities, those leadership opportunities that are available. When it comes to, Black Lives Matter, I always think to myself, if you can be part of the movement here in Calgary, or even just if you need to start at your school, just get a coalition of your classmates and your, and people within, if you need to start small, like sometimes, the big movements can be pretty overwhelming. And so sometimes I tell my kids, well, you know what, just start either at your church. Get the youth together at your church, right? And then start talking about how you can get more, involved. How can you educate other churches, for instance, on the Black Lives Matter movement, right? Like, what are the opportunities or their schools that they're in? So it's about taking, don't get overwhelmed by the big pieces. Sometimes it's volunteering in small locations like your schools, like your churches, coming together and working out a way to be involved more meaningfully in the Black Lives Movement, because I think it would be really important. I think our youth need to be involved as much as possible. In terms of internalized racism, that is an interesting one, isn't it? And so how is it that we start loving ourselves? And that's really what it gets down to, right? Like, I mean, one of the things about why we don't feel so good about ourselves is that we've been told, again, that we're less than, right? And so it is about a process of, like, remember I told in my story about forgiving myself, forgiving my communities, forgiving my parents, just taking the moments to really reflect on your life. And as I said, it's about reconciliation, but sometimes with yourself. That there is a big part of, like, I know I said there was a lot of mistakes I've made in my past, and I had to own to it, but I also had to forgive. It's a really big part of it. The other part is when you come together as a community and we start talking about our experiences of racism, but it also is an opportunity to talk about our strength as well, and to see us as incredible people. Like, it took me a while to really appreciate why being a Malayali was so important. I did not think it was important. I didn't like the color of my skin, nothing. But now, like, I love it. And I love being a Malayali because I took the time. So sometimes I'll ask the questions to people in my team or people I work with to say, understand your culture. So, for me, being a Malayali, so state of Kerala, let's learn the history of Kerala. I learned how Christianity actually came to India. It came there back in St. Thomas's time. Imagine, a lot of people don't realize that actually Christianity started before everything was going on in Europe, right? We have our origins from the time of the 12 apostles. And so, but I didn't know that. And so to understand, the strength of our communities, why we were so amazing. We also had some problems too, and the influences. We had the Portuguese influence, we had the Dutch influence, which was really kind of interesting to me. So taking the time to learn about yourself, and then, as I said, and about why, really, our communities are amazing. And so it's coming together to share our stories. And once you start doing that, as I said, and Cynthia and I talked about this earlier too, there's something about surrendering and just trusting God in all of this. And when you trust, you genuinely let go and trust, I cannot tell you how beautiful that is, and how different when you come to peace with who you are and what your faith means in all of this, and surrendering sometimes to what's happening, but in such a way that it said you fight with compassion. There's something different that happens, right? I'm sure so many people have gone through this. Anyway, there's so many other things I could say, but I just don't have time.
Yeah, and I think there was the one question on gender. Sorry, did you maybe want to read that question again, just to make sure we cover that off?
Okay. So the person was saying, I think we should talk about how gender also plays a part in how people treat Black individuals. I actually did have another question on gender. Maybe I can just merge it if it could, I don't know, probably throw more light on the, okay, so, okay, it's more talking about colorism. It says, let's talk about colorism and how it subconsciously slips into our perspective of other Black or brown people. Let's talk about the expectations of a Black woman and how we can remove ourselves from that and be who God called us to be.
Cynthia, do you want to take this one, or?
Yeah, I'm trying to think about that piece. I don't know, gender, it's an interesting one, sort of the role that it plays, you know, with this work, or talks about racism. You know, and I think, and it's interesting because, like, with the public proceedings on anti-racism, one of the city councilors had talked about, like, there was so many women, so many female leaders that were at the forefront, really driving the work and the movement. And I think this is how it's always been. Like, and you know, when you go back to, again, studying the history of African societies prior to colonization, there was such a strong role that like African women, or even racialized women, Indigenous women, have played in really carrying the community and really pushing a lot of the causes at the forefront. And so I think there's such a significant role, you know, for us to play as, you know, female leaders. And so, yeah, I think that's just the one thing that I would encourage, is for us, you know, we as women, to continue, you know, carrying the community, being a voice, being that go-to. I don't know if I'm making sense, but I don't know, Jenny, maybe if you want to jump in here and kind of elaborate on what I'm saying.
I mean, there's no question women of color experience more oppression than men of color. I mean, think about the double oppressions coming together. You know, you've heard the term of intersectionality, and that really is about the fact of, you know, how, you know, the system oppresses people of color, but they also oppress women. And when the two come together, you know, it makes it even doubly difficult for women to kind of claw out of all of that, right? Because, because sexism is alive and well as well. So we can't say that sexism doesn't exist. And so it exists in the racism world as well, where, as I said, women are treated like they have more barriers to go through than men. You know, that being said, so one thing, like to Cynthia's point, I always say that, you know, getting a chance to watch some incredible women in my life. And I always say the families that I've watched, it seems like the women always are the ones that get right back up and keep fighting, right? Like I really do believe our women are so remarkable and they're so strong, and they, like, you know, we keep pushing them down, and they keep getting up. And they'll work at the crappy jobs. They'll do anything it takes to, you know, help their families survive. I've seen, you know, many families where, you know, men are dealing with, you know, the issues that they're not employed in their area of expertise, and they'll just stop. But for some reason, there's something about women that I've seen is that just get right back up, and they'll work at McDonald's. They'll work, you know, cleaning toilets somewhere because they know the job has to get done. They keep pushing them down, they keep getting back up again. And that really speaks to me about the resilience of our women. And we don't appreciate them for who they are. We still see them as weak. And so many of our communities do see our women as weak. But if we really sat and thought about it, I don't know, I think it's our women that actually, to Cynthia, what she said, they were the ones that showed up to city council. It was not the men. Now I understand that, you know, there are other issues of why men may not have shown up. But you know what? I mean, I'm proud to be a woman of color. I think I'm stronger because of it. I just wish that our societies didn't keep pushing us down, so we had to keep getting up. Like, I wish that wasn't happening, but we do seem to get up, don't we, Cynthia? Like, that's
absolutely
something about us.
Yeah, and I think as a faith community, I think, that's one thing that I would encourage of the leaders is just continue raising, your young girls up, giving them voice, instilling those qualities so that they can go out and continue leading and guiding, whether it's the church or their communities to where they need to be. And, and that's one thing that I'm grateful for. I was raised by a very proud woman, a community woman, and, I do take after my mother in a lot of ways. And if it wasn't for her, just it's that role modeling and that leadership, I wouldn't be in this position today. And actually, I know, Rora, you wanted me to tell this story. My daughter, I never knew she was watching, a lot of the work that I've been doing. And so when the Black Lives Matter movement hit, she approached 2 of the grade 6 teachers. She wanted to do a presentation. She felt like her peers needed to know about racism. They needed to know about the cause. And so she took it upon herself, put together this lovely presentation. I sat, I watched, I was in tears the whole time. She can probably present to all of you. She's a phenomenal presenter. And the same thing with the public consultations on racism. She was very interested and took it upon herself to write a letter as well and, posted it. And so, this is, our kids are watching, they're emulating. And I think it's important for us to instill them with the skills to continue the work because it's important work.
Yeah, thank you so much. These have been really good submissions. Just gonna hand over to the pastors now for any final thoughts, a wrap up. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much. Just before I give the vote of thanks, I just want to quickly, in a few minutes, talk about the, so many things have come up, the speakers have really dealt with so many areas, but the time is always too short for this type of discussion, Are people frozen? Are you hearing me? It's frozen?
No,
Oh,
we're good.
okay.
We're good.
Oh, okay. Yeah, all right, thanks. So the aspect I want to, especially because of, what brought all this to the fore is the death of Floyd. And what it signifies to me is that many people just came to the realization that there is a kind of rejection, right? And many people react differently to rejection, I look at the spiritual side of this thing, and when you look at the spiritual side of people who are rejected, who feel rejected, it's a bit, it's difficult to just look at it and walk away from it. Why? Because it has other implications, right? Like I preached a message recently. We talked about how to handle the pain of rejection, right? When you feel that you are rejected in the race, as a race, that you're not good enough. It actually injures the spirit, right? And once the spirit is injured, you begin to react and feel less than a human being, and you begin to look at yourself as inferior. It starts from, that moment where your spirit was, affected. Such experiences of rejection, leave permanent wounds. Whether people are aware of them or not. So sometimes rejection is so wounding and painful that the mind refuses to focus on it, yet that something is there, that deeper than the mind, deeper than the reason, than the memory that is in your spirit, so that's why, the book of Proverbs talks about the spirit of a man will sustain his infirmity, but a wounded spirit, who can bear? So a vibrant spirit helps a person through great difficulties, but a crushed spirit has a crippling effect in all areas of life. So you can see that, it's beyond what we are just, it's beyond what we're really talking about. It's affecting our people. Now I can tell you so many stories. I worked here, and in fact, it's just they just feel that you are not supposed to be in leadership, but your qualification already put you there. So I just say to myself, there is nothing you can do about that. In fact, there's nothing I can do about it. I'm here already. So here I am. You've got to deal with me, right? But you feel, at one point, I felt so bad when it was that I saw it in the leadership, right? Particularly, it was so bad when I found that a fellow Black man who was supposed to be heading a particular portion of where I worked, but because he was just Black, so somebody else as junior to him will want to preside, not want to, will actually preside in meetings. But when it comes to signatures, right, in that industry, right, because this guy that is presiding cannot sign beyond $5,000 for jobs to be done. But the guy you are presiding over, a Black guy, anything beyond 5,000, you go to his office to sign, to get it signed. But when you are in meetings, you give him directives. Does that make sense? So this is, but what I come to say, to tell people is that, look, don't let this thing, well, at one time I just said, okay, this can be a hidden inner attitude you carry about. Like I said, when I gave the message, there were a few things I said to them. I said, 4 reasons for that message was that because some people stop making efforts because they have been rejected once. I don't want that to happen, right? Secondly, as a result of rejection, many people have lost their self-confidence. They lose their self-confidence, right? Some other people's hope has become shattered and scattered because of rejection. They feel that, they can't move further. So others have not recovered from their last rejection. So it's killing of the spirit. It's systemic. And what I just say here, because of, the time is gone down, there's a projection I put out there. It starts from rejection, right? It goes into loneliness. You withdraw. It goes into self-pity, right? It goes into misery, and then depression. And then you have despair and hopelessness. And then, of course, death and suicidal, thoughts coming, So we see some of our people go through, even during times of bully and all of that. You see the trajectory. So what I just say is that I came up with something. I said, look, let's manage this thing. Somebody was saying, will this ever end? I don't think so. Because some people I don't want to say they are born with it, but our new generation, our younger ones, they accept this thing more, and they are more, I think it's fading, right? It's fading, because I remember that my daughter says that she doesn't feel it, and that she's not felt it and all of that. I say, oh, good. It's good you don't feel it. Just continue. But when you start walking, you come back and tell me, in the school level, they are young and all of that, so you don't see much of it. It's there, but it's not really. But when you start walking, but one of the things I said in that message, I'll just quickly read now. I said, things to know about how to handle rejection. I said, the rejection was a decision of a few people, not of the whole world. So when because you have to guard your spirit, don't let it be killed. So just understand that the person is only a few people that rejected you, not many. And then secondly, sometimes before you are accepted, you will be rejected. Just put that in the back of your head. That sometimes before you are accepted, you'll be rejected. And then another thing you put there is, because it's the people that rejected you, not the place. The people that rejected you, not the place, you know? So these are some of the things that can help us to manage this process, you know? It can help us, the younger ones, even ourselves. Don't take it personal. Don't let it come to your spirit. Like I was saying, you know, it goes into even people getting into thinking about suicide or death, you know. So that's my own spiritual side of it. Because some people, they, you know, they feel that, you know, when you are rejected and then you start going into all other things, well, God will help us. Because of our time, I'll end there. And I want to thank the speakers. It's been really, really great having you, Jenny and Cynthia. This is really, really very good. In fact, we look forward to greater times where we will have time for you to present on a, you know, larger scale for us and all of that. I also want to thank the regional pastor and all these other the people watching Facebook also, zonal pastors also, so our parish pastors are also there, and everyone online. I just want to thank you for joining us today, and everyone that has helped in the back end, the technical details. Everyone was really involved in that to make sure that there was no hitch. And I thank God that it came out well. I've worked, well, I've been a volunteer with Jenny on this, working with this city in a board, developing policies, you know, that welcome immigrants, you know, diversity, inclusion. You know, there's so much she has done in that direction, and also our friend she brought along, she, you know, fantastic. This is really great. I just want to thank you all. God bless you. Keep doing what you're doing. We love you. We're there. You know, just, you know, supporting you wherever we can. Yeah. Thank you so much, and God bless you all for watching and coming. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Bye.